Again, that's as reductive as saying history of science alchemy. In my opinion,
okay,
Mike is being reductive.
Everybody at the December seminar of current issues in religious studies and Western Esotericism. Before I start, I have two announcements, and I will forget them, so that's why I start with the announcements. And that is on the 9th of January will be the student conference of the Research MA in Utrecht. For all of you who are interested to go there. And another announcement is concerning this seminar. We will have an extra seminar in May, 11 May. I will send you an email about this. Because we have a visiting scholar. Of course, I've forgotten her name, Manon Heidenberg-White.
Yes.
Yeah?
She's here.
Great! And she's going to talk about gender and religion. So you know all that, you can note it in your diaries, but I will also send you an email about this, and the students are notified by this as well. Okay, welcome at Current Issues. This is a Research Master Seminar in which the students have an active role, and that means that one of them is introducing the speaker. Today that will be Paloma. Another will be chairing. That would have been Fieke, but Fieke just notified us that she has the flu. Mm-hmm. So Paloma is gracious enough to take that role as well. And always the Research Master students have the first opportunity to respond to the lecture. And in this case, Dennis is the one who will give the first response, and unfortunately there are only 2 students today, but fortunately for you that means that you can start the discussion earlier than normal. Another slight change of the program is that normally the speaker is speaking for 45 minutes, but there has been some kind of misunderstanding and our present speaker will talk for an hour, so that you know that as well. The whole seminar is open for everybody until 5:30. 5:30 you are all invited to go over to the other side of the building where drinks will be served and you can discuss things further with our speaker or with each other. But the students stay behind and we have an after session among ourselves until we join you for the drinks. Magic. Normally I have a little story, but these past few days I've only been running around, so the story slipped through my fingers, but this is a very, very important subject. It's a highly complex subject as well. Speaking from my experience in PD days with religious studies, we have noted, I think Carolina you have noted as well, that the whole debate about religion and magic is not fully grasped by the students. So this really needs attention in our educational program. And when I was reading the introduction to the book by Bernd this morning, I thought, oh, I wish I could make a course on this book. But we are diminishing, so that probably won't happen. Anyway, this was my brief introduction, and now I give the floor to Paloma, who will introduce our speaker.
Well, thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. Dr. Bernd Christian Otto studied Religionswissenschaft, philosophy and psychology in Heidelberg, and received his PhD in 2009 with a dissertation on the conceptual history of magic. In 2010, he joined the University of Bergen in Norway as a visiting research fellow, where he edited, together with Michael Stalsberg, an anthology entitled Defining Magic, a Rebirth. Between 2010 and 2018, he worked as a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Erfurt, where he was, among other things, the postdoc coordinator of the research group Religious Individualization in Historical Perspective at the Max Weber Center for Advanced Cultural and Social Studies. In 2017, he finished his habilitation treatise on the history of Western learned magic and received the Venia Legendi for Religionswissenschaft. Part of this treatise was a co-author monograph on a large collection of early modern magic manuscripts from the University Library of Leipzig, entitled Magical Manuscripts in Early Modern Europe. In 2018 to 2019, he was a fellow at the Kate Hamburger College, Bochum University, with a project on contemporary Western magic entitled Mapping Modern Magic. He is currently a research fellow at the International Consortium for Research in the Humanities at the University of Erlangen-Nuremberg. He there works on various things, among them the book project presented today. His most recent publication is a 1,500-page double volume of the proceedings of the college research group in Erfurt, to be published in a couple of days, entitled Religious Individualization, Historical Dimensions and Comparative Perspectives. As may have become clear by now, Professor Otto's research mainly focuses on magic, where he combines different methodologies such as conceptual history, discourse analysis, social theory, and ritual studies. He is a board member of the European Society for the Study of Western Esotericism, and he's very happy to be here today. Let us all give a warm hand to Professor Otto.
Okay. Thank you, Jacqueline, for the introduction. Thank you, Paloma. Thank you, everybody, for being here. Do you hear me? Is that loud enough? Okay. So today I will be speaking about a book project, which I'm currently working on part-time. Well, I'm not actually working on it, but I should. And there are other things in Erlangen, like a large grant proposal. But 45 pages of this have already been written, and it's just, I will give you an outline of what this is about. So what it is about, I mean, this could well be the title, but I'm not yet sure. The general idea is to re-establish magic as a cross-cultural category in comparative religion. So it's a comparative work, cross-cultural, diachronic, analogical comparison, very unusual. It's more or less the opposite of what I've been advocating in my early career, that we should abandon magic because it's too Eurocentric and polemical and what have you. So now I reversed 180 degrees, but with a trick. So let's see how that works and if I convince you if this is possible or plausible to do. So the lecture will have 3 big steps. After some preliminary remarks, I will give a few instances from 3 different domains, which I named the conceptual intellectual domain, the discursive domain, and the ritual domain, and then come to some conclusions, and I will explain what I mean by this now. So first of all, we all know, or we all might be aware, that magic is quite omnipresent in modern popular culture. I've been in this movie last week with my daughter. It's really fascinating. Not only the movie, which is full of magic, and also quite sophisticated elemental magic and patterns from the historical discourse, like the salamander as the fire spirit, etc. So I was quite impressed. But also the ads, 30 minutes of ads before the movie. There were probably 15 other movies advertised, and 13 of these 15 movies were about magic. So I was even more impressed by the amount of magic that is loaded onto this generation's children, right? And I don't know what you make of this, but it seems to me that this has become more and more. So Harry Potter was a mark shed, what can you say?
Watershed, yeah.
A watershed,
Yeah.
and now the children they are raised in a magical world. My daughter is. She lives in the fairy and in the unicorn world, and so it seems to be more and more. And I don't know what this actually means. We might discuss this in the end. But there are, of course, other examples of this. Who knows this series? Yeah, at least one. Okay, I thought more. But only 4 students here, right? Okay.
No.
Anyway,
More.
it's quite interesting.
It's based on a novel, isn't it?
Yeah, it's based on
I've read
novels.
the novel once.
And then there are, of course, classic novels, so we have it in literature, also child literature full of magic. I just read this to my daughter.
A uni pig.
A uni pig, which is able to materialize food. Okay, then there is the area of computer games full of magic. This is Magic the Gathering. Who has played this?
No, a student once gave me a card.
Only one.
Yeah.
I thought I expected more. Anyway, then there is live role-playing games, and from there is only a small step to, let's call it real magic. This is taken from the Facebook page of the OTO.
Yeah.
This is actually a famous image of a Wiccan ritual, Stonehenge, from the 1970s. This is a guy whom I'm a bit working on right now in a field work. He's called Harley Swifty Reagan, also a neo-shaman magician. Fascinating stuff. Then we also have the stage magic thing. Who is this?
David Copperfield. Yeah.
He's the most successful single performer of all times, of all genres, with an estimated 600 shows every year since over 30 years.
Oh, okay.
So he's in Las Vegas. He can do it in the morning and in the evening. And he has acquired $800 million right now. So magic sells. And then there are advertisements, because magic sells. So thousands of electronic products like this one, bear magic in the product title. And I find this quite cool, actually. Anyway, what do we make of this? How can we explain this extreme omnipresence and popularity of magic as a pop cultural motive, given that we all know, or seem to know, that it was predominantly associated with superstition, false religion, irrationality, etc., over the past centuries, or even millennia? So I cannot answer this question today. It's not the topic of the lecture, I'm afraid, but we might discuss it later anyway. What I want to do today is kind of ponder what it is all about, or in more general terms, what magic might mean or might not mean. And I'll do this because magic has been criticized a lot by many scholars to being almost meaningless, or an empty signifier, or to be discarded. And I was one of them, but I changed my mind, and so this is kind of an experiment. I think it can function as a meaningful second order category in the study of religion. So let's think about what would be the prerequisites for this to happen. I think modern terms in religious studies that are usable and that work in a pragmatic sense, so they create meaning or more meaning, they should meet 5 criteria. So they should avoid basic conceptual traps. Circular definitions or definitions ex negativo should be avoided. So magic is not science or not religion is kind of too easy. They should be as precise as possible, so not too broad and not too narrow. They should be non-essentialist. That's kind of a demand to modern concepts. I will come back to what that might mean. They should not be overly Eurocentric and project Western stuff onto other cultures. And they should allow for meaningful comparison. And we will try to find out what meaningful comparison means over the course of the lecture. Now, I don't know any definitions of magic or theories of magic that meet these criteria for the time being. Most existing definitions, and I will not go into definitions today, so you have them in the handout. There are some definitions: Fraser, Durkheim, Malinowski, Pritchard, blah blah. All these definitions. None of them work. because most of them define magic ex negativo. Magic is non-scientific or non-religious. There is the magic science religion triangle, which you have also in the handout or in the text. Most definitions are either too broad or too narrow. They essentialize magic by referring to an allegedly distinct, unique, and unalterable thing in the world. Most modern definitions are derived from Western stereotypes, and so they are inevitably Eurocentric. And therefore, they do not allow for meaningful comparison. They are either broad wastebasket categories, in the words of Walter Hanegraaff, who's not here, unfortunately, or they highlight only similarities, so it's only sympathetic magic from antiquity to today, only hair locks. So, of course, we can trace the use of hair locks from antiquity to today, but then a lot is missing. So now let's take a small step back and pose the question why we should do comparison after all. I mean, today we live in an academic environment where we are all highly specialized. So we only work on case studies, basically. No one is allowed to compare anymore, not least on a global scale. It's much too dangerous. So why? And I think there are a few reasons. So you all have heard of the phenomenology of religion. And since the decline of that, let's call it discipline, comparison has had a very bad reputation. It's considered to be essentialist. So you can only compare by strongly decontextualizing the items, and then you lose a lot of important information. You usually ahistoricize everything when you compare, which is also problematic. And there's a one-sided focus on similarities and neglecting differences. And then you create a phenomenon and try to seek the essence, and then you have it. That's the stereotype about phenomenology of religion. But these critiques, they often forget that comparison is part of every process of interpretation and understanding. Every study in the history of religion or in the study of religion is comparative in various ways. So usually you have contextual comparisons, so you compare sources, different sources from one context. That's comparison. Or you have genealogical comparison. You trace a development over time. You compare sources by one author or several authors over the centuries, how ideas develop, etc. So we have comparison anyway. And there are a few more arguments to this. I cannot go into depth. But I mean, my goal now is to go a step further and reconceptualize magic as a comparative category that can be applied to any religious data. So it's diachronic and cross-cultural analogical comparison. But how do I do that? Any idea? Magic. No, okay. It's my job to do that, I know. So we don't want to relapse into essentialism or Eurocentrism. We cannot rely on the vagueness of everyday language and use magic without defining anything, for instance, or discard the term. So what do? So my idea is to apply a methodological tool that is called reverse engineering. Ann Taves and Igel Esprem have done that with the terms esotericism and religion in 2 papers from 2015. So they consider like these big monster categories, they're complex cultural constructs that have evolved over time and accumulated a lot of meanings. And reverse engineering consists of chopping these terms into smaller bits and pieces. Kind of, reverse engineer the process of the category, how it acquired these different meanings, and then go back and kind of distinguish these various bits and pieces. And my idea is that we can also do that with magic, and then use the smaller bits and pieces as the items that we use in comparative religion. And of course, every comparison has to begin with what we know. So I have to take the Western conceptual history of magic, because it's a Western term, as a starting point, and then look at what is there. What are the meanings that the term has acquired over the centuries? What are the main functions? And then, in this term, particularly important, what are the rituals, or the ritual techniques, or the ritual patterns that have been labeled magic over the course of time? And therefore, I distinguish three domains: the conceptual intellectual domain, the discursive domain, and the ritual domain. Yes. What's this? Okay. There should be a table of contents. Okay, so we have to do without it. Surprise. Okay, I will begin with the conceptual intellectual domain. So, the conceptual intellectual domain is about concepts and ideas. So, concepts, in this case it's about magic. So we look into the conceptual history of magic. And then we look at the ideas that have been called magic or labeled magic or ascribed to magic. That's the job of intellectual history. And the two are, of course, related. So I think magic is not an empty signifier, as I've written 10 years ago. I would maybe call it a floating signifier that changes its meanings all the time, depending on the context. But it's not arbitrary, but there are some basic or core meanings that we can extract from the conceptual history of magic. And I think 4 basic or core meanings are ritual, power, miracle, and wish fulfillment. And I will go through each of these briefly. So these are 4 basic meanings of the term magic, okay? When you look at the conceptual history, these are, I would say, the most important meanings. The first one is ritual, or ritual practice. So I understand ritual as repetitive behavior, often based on scripts, or oral or written scripts. And then the rituals themselves, they rely kind of on opaque efficacy. So the performance of the ritual is only indirectly linked to the causality that is envisaged by the practitioners. Is that understandable? You cannot see the effect. It's opaque.
Yeah, opaque.
Opaque. Rituals are causally opaque. I make the ritual, and I don't see the effect with my 5 senses. I have to wait, maybe, until it works or it doesn't work. It doesn't seem to work. And ritual is such a basic meaning of magic that certain terms always figure in the sources, such as pragmateia in Greek, which is simply action. It is one of the most used headlines for a recipe or a ritual in the Greek magical papyri, because that's what it is. It's practice, or pragmateia or praxis. And the Latin equivalent would be experimentum, which is probe or trial. So these are like headlines for the recipes. Do this, and then we'll see. And then a fixed formulation like the artis magicae, or in Greek the techne, or the magical arts have developed out of the basic understanding that magic is about ritual. And this happened because the Greek term magos originally emerged as the Greek equivalent of an old Persian priest title, magos. And these Achaemenid priests, which became known during the Persian Wars, they performed certain practices, oneiromancy, hospitality rites, and sacrifices, and other stuff for the Persian rulers. And this led to the formation of the term magic. In the beginning, magia is what the magicians do, or the practice, the techne of the magician. That's the historical root. And this is so central that I find it weird to speak of ritual magic because it's synonymous for me in a way. I always wonder what people mean when they say ritual magic. Because magic is ritual is one of the basic semantic patterns in the semantic field of magic. Anyway, since these beginnings in classical Greece, magic was associated with the performance of certain rites. Not any rites, but rites that tapped on opaque powers. I will come to that. That's the second semantic building block. They aimed at rather miraculous events. So flying or invisibility, of course, is a miraculous event. But it's also making someone fall in love is also kind of weird. We're not used to that idea. Or even in cultures where that is widespread, it's still unusual, I would say. It's extraordinary. And these rituals often focused on individual wish fulfillment. That's the fourth. building block. Now the second one, as I just said, is power. We also have various synonyms that appear in the sources, like pneuma, sympatheia, or magia naturalis, in the Greek and Latin languages. And modern examples of this notion can be found in many advertisements. So this is even redundant, okay? Power, magic, battery, it's all three, it's about power. Yeah, anyway.
That is black.
And here we have these magic stones. They provide power for manifesting desires.
Wow.
So you can always exchange magic with power, and it still makes sense. That's what I mean. Now, in the conceptual history of magic, the first author to isolate the semantic notion of power in the semantic field of magic, making it independent of ritual, was Plotinus. So he used the Greek concept of sympatheia to signify an all-pervading force that ties all existing things together. And then Marsilio Ficino, who's well known in the circle, came in the 15th century and equalized sympatheia with magia and created the notion of magia naturalis. And what is important here is that it's an extension of the original idea that rituals have power. Of course, they are efficacious, or they don't have power, they are not efficacious. But then at some point people started saying, or Plotinus, and then Ficino and others, that it is the same power that makes the crop grow and the stars move, etc. So it's a basic power that works in the universe. And the magician can tap on these powers, but the powers are there anyway. They exist independently of the performance of rituals. So it's two different notions. And you can find this in everyday language. So magic is used to refer to some hidden power of things, like the magic of poetry, the power of poetry, the magic of yoga, the magic of the pyramids, the magic of crystals, etc. So you still have this idea of magic as a power in everyday language. The third semantic building block is miracle, in the sense of extraordinary, wondrous event, particularly with regard to capabilities, so what humans can do. So this notion you find strongly in modern stage magic, so it's all about wondering and miraculous things which cannot be, but I just saw it. But you also have it in sports journalism, like Magic Jordan and a lot of other examples. So he's a magician because he can do extraordinary things. Okay. And in the historical sources, in the conceptual history of magic, they were ascribed, or they claimed, to be capable of flying, invisibility, bilocation, controlling natural events, the flow of rivers, drawing down the moon is a very famous formulation that also made it into modern Wicca. Also control other people's feelings, behavior, and destiny. So all these rather miraculous things were ascribed to magicians. And interestingly, a crucial line of argument in the polemics, in the anti-magical polemics, was whether these miraculous events were evoked with or without rituals. So the notions are interrelated. So if someone wanted to defend himself against the charge of being a magician, he would say, I didn't do a ritual, but he did. Like this happened many times. But from a discursive perspective, it doesn't make sense to oppose magic and miracle, because miracle is simply a semantic pattern in the semantic field of magic. Did you understand that, what I mean by that? Miracle is part of the semantic field of magic. Yeah, okay. Thanks. Now the fourth building block, which I will discuss today, is wish fulfillment. So in Western history, the rites, many ritual scripts, and if you look at them in pre-modern sources, 95% are on short-term inner-worldly goals. That's what I mean by wish fulfillment. Basically, I mean, the pattern would be contingency management. You don't know what happens next, but I want to control this, blah, blah. The classical realms were love, wealth, protection, healing, and harm. We have a lot of examples of this in the modern magic with a K discourse. 3 publications by a German magician whom I know quite well, Ralf Tickmeyer. He made it all. Money magic, a book on money magic, a book on protection. Then in the Anubis, a journal from the 1980s, he published a few chapters on Kampfmagie, battle magic.
Oh, okay.
And then there's, of course, sex magic. I mean, he means something else than making someone fall in love, but you know that. Anyway, this is about wish fulfillment. And I would say that large parts of the propaganda or the anti-magical polemics were driven by an allergic response of religious elites to this notion, to the notion of wish fulfillment. They would consider it false religion or blasphemous because the gods cannot and should not be bribed by offerings of prayers. Plato was the first to formulate a law against magic, pharmakeia, and many later laws kind of picked up these arguments. So the idea is the gods, there is divine providence, omniscience, and omnipotence, and human beings simply cannot interfere with that. Okay? They should be dependent on the influences, choices, and interventions of divine powers or gods. So accept this, subordinate to God's will, and utter thy will be done. I mean, that's very exaggerated. But that's basically where it comes from. There is God and his omnipotence, and magic, from this point of view, appears as an illegitimate self-empowerment allegedly against the will of God. Now, anyway, in the book I will take each of these 4 semantic building blocks and use these building blocks in order to engage in cross-cultural comparison. That's the basic idea. I will not use magic as a tertium comparationis, but these smaller building blocks, like ritual, power, miracle, and wish fulfillment. And I will show you a few examples with the notion of ritual, how this might work. Okay? So now, ritual is my tertium comparationis, because the advantage of this building block approach is that these notions can be conceptualized and analyzed independently of one another. Okay, so we will look for concepts in other cultural religious contexts that resemble the semantics of magic in the sense of ritual or ritual practice. And in the other chapters it will be miracle, power, and wish fulfillment, but now I will only show you as an example how this might work with ritual. So we start with looking at an example from Western learned magic. This is the ritual script, PGM7, from the Greek magic papyri, that's 4th century. And it's a phylacterion, so it's a protective amulet with the famous Ouroboros, the snake that bites its tail, and a few voces magicae, probably god names, and also characteres, probably also god names, in an alternative script, and written on a leaf or gold or silver or tin or hieratic papyrus. And this is called mageia, magic in the Greek magic papyrus. Such practices with certain techniques. We will not look at the techniques in detail now. But this is the starting point, the analytical starting point. And now I will move around a bit. Okay, one example which I chose is taken from an old Akkadian text named Maklu. Who knows that text?
No.
No?
Yeah.
No one? Okay.
Yeah.
Ah, yeah, you know. Good. So I will only briefly go over it. It's Cuneiform script, old Akkadian. It dates to around 800 before Christ. It's usually written on 9 stone tablets, and it survives in many different versions, several complete versions. So the text provides the lengthiest and most elaborate apotropaic ritual script. So it's also kind of a phylacterion. It's a script how to protect yourself against attacks by malevolent ritual practitioners. They're called kashaktu, translated as witches, and they are responsible for the disease of a client. It's a very important text in the Babylonian Assyrian Empire. It was part of the teaching curriculum, and it was regularly performed for the king. So it's really on a high social status. And the overall concept, and this is what I'm looking for, to denote the ritual, is ashiputu. So here we have a term. I'm looking for other terms that have the same semantic spectrum. And this is usually translated by Schwemer, who is the specialist on this text, as exorcistic lore or also art of conjuration. And Ashiputo is also a genuine text genre in ancient Mesopotamia with thousands of canonical texts, so it was really huge. And conceptually, it's a subcategory of medicine. And now this makru, this lengthy text, outlines a ritual that begins in the evening and lasts until the next morning. And it basically consists of uttering conjuration formula addressed to various Babylonian gods. And at the heart of the ritual, numerous statuettes that present the aggressors are burnt in a kind of oven. So makru literally means burning. That's what it looks like.
Oh, wow.
And I have an excerpt. I will not read this. Just let you see. It's also addressed at the fire god. So the ritual mechanic is different from the previous example, but it's also similar enough to say that Ashiputo is a category for certain type of ritual practices, which can be maybe compared to Magayan. I can only do this very brief because there's more to say. My second example is from the Atharva Veda. As you probably know, it's part of the Vedas, the holy Sanskrit text of Indian Brahmins. It's today considered the fourth and last component of the Vedic corpus, dated to roughly 900 before Christ. The Atharva Veda stands out from the other Vedas because it's foremost a ritual companion. I don't know if you've looked at it. It's ritual after ritual after ritual, mostly scripts. And they are mostly about healing, protection, love, prosperity, and other innerworldly matters. It's also called the Veda of magical formulas because of that. And my example is taken from book 3, which focuses also on apotropaic rituals. And the Sanskrit meta-category here is abhichara, which is sometimes or often translated as black magic. And abhichara is a subcategory of Sanskrit kriyam, which means action, or karma is also action. And usually in the Veda, these two terms denote a ritual, which means sacrificial actions for the benefits of God. But abhichara is special because it's not directed for the benefit of something, but against something or someone. That's why it's unusual, and it's also set apart from the other Vedic rituals. It's kind of in a gray zone. And there's more to say about this, which I cannot do now, but it's kind of interesting. It's part of the Vedic corpus, but it's also in a shady moral area, and it's questionable whether the gods will do it. But you can, of course, support that by certain means, which we will see later. So this is just also another example, prayer for protection, and you make a talisman from wood of a certain tree, and then the practitioner utters a story and addresses certain gods, historiola, blah blah, and then you have the talisman. So it's also an apotropaic ritual, and the concept is abhichara. And then I thought it's interesting to take a modern anthropological example into the basket of comparative terms. And I chose the classic, Evans Pritchard's Magic, Witchcraft and Oracles among the Azande. And as you may or may not know, Evans Pritchard here investigated kind of a triangle of practices. They are the three sides of explaining misfortune in the Azande culture from Sudan from the 1930s. So something bad happens, and the Azande usually ascribe it to mangu, which is witchcraft. And mangu is not a practice, but a substance that resides in some people, and which you can find out by autopsy, but also by poison oracle, which is the second element. So you give chicken a certain poison, and then it's yes or no, whether you guessed the right person, the correct person, and then the third step, which is usually not really, it's kind of overlooked. You do ritual countermeasures, and that's the ngua. And ngua works, so it's translated as medicine, but it's in fact objects fashioned from trees and plants and sometimes animals, inspired by similarities. And these objects, or ngua, they are placed somewhere, worn, cooked, eaten, spit, or smeared onto one's body. Sometimes there is a spell, a sema, and also the practitioner talks to the medicines and tells them what he wants them to do. And only rarely spirits are involved, so it's mostly kind of mechanical. And the whole culture is, the Zande culture was kind of centered around these practices, and also ngua, with a lot of interesting social aspects, which I can only brush over now. So there are certain taboos when using these. There's a lot of secrecy, so it's a non-public ritual performance. There is an even more, so there is a category for immoral ngua, which is called gbegere ngua. And you cannot kill someone with gbegere ngua, it's forbidden. It's death penalty. But you can kill a witch with ngua. Then everybody uses it in certain situations like hunting. It's an elderly male domain. There's some professionalization, so you have to pay for it. It's intergenerational transmission. Ngua is considered to be intelligence, so the medicine finds the victim. And there are even associations, so there's some kind of institutionalization that took place in the Zande culture. So this was very brief. I will do it in a more detailed way in the book, but we can already say now that there are some similarities and differences between these four terms, namely Mageia, Ashiputu, Abichara, and Ngua. All terms refer to a specific type of seemingly similar instrumental rituals directed at inwardly goals. So in this case, I only chose protection, but we can also find the same thing for love or curses, other aspects. So we have, in other cultures, we have meta-categories for these ritual practices. We usually have a recipe-like style and performance of rituals, so it's ritual categories. We have hidden agents of ritual efficacy, and usually we have the use of speech, herbs, animals, and other artifacts. But then there are also differences. There are differences on the level of ritual techniques, of course, so it's not all the same. It's different ritual techniques and micro-techniques, which is interesting to disentangle, I think. There are different ritual mechanics, so how the rituals are explained is different. How the rituals are efficient, or how they work, is explained differently. So some of these categories involve transcendent addressees, Mageia, Ashiputu, Abichara. It's usually the spirits that make the effect to happen. Or there's an inherent efficacy or even intelligence in the ritual artifacts, which would be Ngua, but there are also other examples of more mechanistic ritual efficacy explanations. Then the social context, which is the discursive domain, is very different. Sometimes they are contested, marginal, or criminal. Mageia was certainly forbidden in late ancient Egypt under Roman law. Abichara is in a gray zone, but Ashiputu was clearly institutionalized, and also Ngua. It's mainstream. There is no debate about that. There are different moralities in these different contexts. So, as I already said, it's legitimate to kill with Ngua, but not with Mangu or Gbegere Ngua. And Abichara is part of the Vedic canon, but works against the cosmic order of the gods. So, to begin with, it's interesting to ponder these similarities and differences. This is one goal of the book. to compare not only means making things equal and similar, but also to see what the differences are in the different items. And through juxtaposition, each item can be understood maybe a bit better than before. That's one of the assumptions of comparative religion. So, 10 to 5. Good. I'm now going to the second domain, which I just mentioned. It's not only about concepts and ideas, it's also about social contexts and discursive practices. Yeah. And in the case of the Western concept of magic, in many publications I distinguish two major discourses that have shaped the history of magic from antiquity to today. I call them the discourse of exclusion and the discourse of inclusion. So we have a polemical, anti-magical discourse: magic is bad, you are a magician, and it's immoral, and it's inefficacious, it's blasphemous, what have you, all these polemics. And then on the other hand, there's a self-referential discourse by people who claim the label and say, no, it's great, it's efficacious, it's absolutely legitimate, I'm allowed to do it, God even gave me permission. And yeah, it's morally acceptable, I'm even helping other people with it all. Yes, so these are the two major discourses, so the discourse of inclusion and the discourse of exclusion. And in the social domain, I will not so much focus on the discourse of inclusion, but mostly on the discourse of exclusion. That is on magic's discursive function to devalue and ostracize others. So you can devalue an individual or a group, or even entire religions, to be some magical weirdo stuff. And this has happened often in the conceptual history of magic. And from a comparative perspective, now the task is to see whether these othering dynamics, whether terms are used with a similar function in non-Western cultural frameworks. And yeah, this is a brief overview over the Western discourse of exclusion. I would say until the 20th century, the discourse of exclusion, the anti-magical, the polemical discourse was dominant. And there were three major accusations. Magic was considered anti-religious, inefficacious, and antisocial or immoral. At least since the early Roman Empire, magic was considered a major crime. So there's the Crimen Magiae, and which entered a lot of legislative texts and also stood behind the early modern witch persecutions. And I will now take the early modern European witch hunts as my analytical starting point. But we could also use other examples like other folks as sorcerous peoples. So we also have that as a cross-cultural pattern, or the devaluation of individuals. But I will now look at large-scale criminalization and persecution. And as you probably know, the early modern European witch persecutions, this is only, again, a very superficial overview. They happened roughly between 1430 and 1700, with a climax between 1580 and 1650. And current estimations are some 50 to 60,000 executions in Europe. And depending on the region, roughly 75% were women. In Central Europe, the more north you go, the more men you have, as a very rough simplification. Now, the early modern witch persecutions were based on an idea of witchcraft that encompassed 4 to 6 elements. The most important thing was the pact with the devil, so each witch made a formal pact. Then the coupling with the devil, sexual intercourse. The third one is meeting other witches and the devil on the witch Sabbath. And the fourth element is the maleficium, the malevolent ritual act. And then eventually there's also other patterns, the witch flight and animal transformations, other aspects. Now let's assume for a moment that only the maleficium, the malevolent ritual act, is observable, and the others are imagined or stereotypical. Many causes have been posed for the extreme events that happened in modern Europe. I will not go into these, but they are important for the comparative analysis. Now, there have been theological radicalizations, Thomas Aquina's demon pact theory, for instance, legislative changes in the late Middle Ages that changed the manner how you could make a charge or a legislative accusation. Of course, there are wars, diseases, the pestilence, plague, economic crisis. The Reformation played a role. Letterpress printing is very important. Gender stereotypes, weather phenomena, the small ice age, whatever it is, and of course torture. So torture is among the top reasons. And there were basically two logics of accusation. So there was the denunciation, the bottom-up approach, and the top-down through torture, and the idea that witches meet on the Sabbath. So every witch knows other witches, and when you torture people, who else did you meet? And then you have these lists of names that become longer and longer the more people you torture, and the longest list is some 1,300 names. So you have these chain trials. Now, my idea is to compare this to other witch hunts. Now, what does witch actually mean? We just saw the European understanding or the stereotype. But when we look contemporary, globally, we see that a high amount of witch hunts have happened across the globe over the past decades. And these witch hunts caused far more victims compared to 300 years of European persecutions. So only in Tanzania, estimates calculate 1,000 victims per year over the past decade. So only Tanzania is like one of the hotspots of witch persecutions and lynch justice and these things. But there, sub-Saharan Africa is really a hot area for witch persecutions over the past decades. And there has been a lot of political attempts to get a hold on this problem, and there has been a very influential UN report, which is also very interesting to read, which I rely on now. And they use a very basic witchcraft definition of harmful actions carried out by persons presumed to have access to supernatural powers. So basically, this is a very bottom line idea that people believe in the efficacy of malevolent rituals. That's the bottom line, and you have that in many areas of the world still today. And in Tanzania, for instance, 95% of the people believe in exactly that. And there are witch persecutions in many areas of the world, also in Asia, Central America, or the Middle East, but most is going on in sub-Saharan Africa. Now, is it really the same phenomenon? That's the comparative question. Again, there are similarities and differences. Similarities, so in pre-modern Europe, as well as in modern-day sub-Saharan Africa, most people believe in the efficacy of malevolent rituals. That's the fundamental prerequisite for this to work. Witchcraft explains misfortunes, well, that's the Evans-Pritchard's thesis. It's also there in both cases. Usually, bad circumstances produce a rise in witchcraft accusations. These bad circumstances can be social, economic, political, or medical crises. Usually, it's weak, deviant people who are the victims. So, women, as well in Europe, as in pre-modern Europe, as well as in Sub-Saharan Africa, are mostly the victims, but also poor, sick, elderly, and children. And in both cases, we have bottom-up prosecutions and lynch law. And in both cases, we have economic benefits, partly. So sometimes you can seize the property of the person you successfully accused or killed. And in both cases, there are almost no self-proclaimed witches. So in Europe, from a certain moment on, you have these weird self-proclaimed witches, which is kind of hard to explain, but it is explainable. And in Africa too, no one with a desire to survive would self-proclaim as witch. Most people would call themselves maybe called witch doctor, and then offer services also below the radar, but not a witch yourself. Anyway, there are also differences. The European concept of witchcraft is not relevant for modern persecutions. So there is no pact with the devil, no Sabbath, and no intercourse with the devil, even in areas where Pentecostalism is strong. So you might assume where evangelical churches have a grip onto the population, there is more of that? No. The only thing you find is that the churches offer their services to exorcise, especially children. You have that in Nigeria and Congo, so like thousands and thousands of children that are exorcised because they carry witchcraft, but there is no, the European concept of witchcraft does not stand behind these modern persecutions. They are usually today below the radar of legislation, so usually all the states, they criminalize witch persecutions, so the logic is reversed. And also in the population there's a mistrust against the governments, so it's kind of below the radar. It's a different legal situation. There are no chain trials, so there is no torture. This is also different. You might say it's the chain trials that led to these high amounts of victims. No, you don't even need them. In Africa, particularly crucial is the killing of own relatives. So it's not you don't protect your kin, but it's often the relatives that become subject of accusations. You have the strong impact of child witches and many thousands of abandoned or killed children in Nigeria, especially. And then you have the phenomenon of albino hunting. So every year, hundreds and hundreds of killings of albinos, especially in Tanzania. Tanzania is the global country with the highest rate of albinos, 1 out of 1,200, and usually it's 1 out of 23,000. And then the body parts of albinos are considered efficacious in magical rituals, And then there is a relationship between diseases like HIV and witchcraft. And then there is a lot of migration and all these civil wars and wars in Africa, as you know. And this leads to witchcraft accusations on 3 levels, because when people migrate, they are confronted with other peoples, and usually the others are performing witchcraft. That's one of the way it works. But then also within the refugee camps, the more dense people sit together, the more accusations. And then when they come back to their original countries, then they are accused of having learned new types of witchcraft by the ones who stayed at home. This is also a problem. And then, of course, in Africa we have actually very vivid ritual traditions, sometimes called Vaudin, particularly in West Africa, so it's not all made up. I mean, people do practice these rites. And in pre-modern Europe, we don't even know what people practice. I mean, we know it a bit, but much of it was purely stereotypical. So again, we have similarities and differences, which I think is interesting in itself. We don't need Christian demonology and the idea of a world conspiracy of the devil. We don't need public court cases and torture-based chain trials to have massive persecutions with thousands of victims every year. All we need is poverty, malnutrition, diseases, economic crisis, and a general belief in the efficacy of rituals to have people devalue, persecute, and kill one another. So this definition, it kind of works to see that belief in ritual efficacy is the widespread